Okay, so today we'll be talking about the coast Miwok. We're going to start talking before colonization, so when the Native Americans arrived to California up to 1595. So the geographic location, there was three main locations where Miwok tribes were: northern coast, north shore of San Francisco Bay, and the Sierra Nevadas. These all were kind of different terrains, so they each had different weathers, but that's the location. Specifically, some popular places they were Ayala Cove, Camp Reynolds, Fort McDowell, and the immigration station. Language, they spoke a Penutian language. Each tribe spoke Coast Miwok, but they all spoke different dialects. So at one time, they counted 1,500 Coast Miwok speakers. I found it important that to get the name of their tribe, it was the people of, in whatever their language was, the village of. And I just think that that's pretty important to their language since it differs. Their subsistence strategies, they used earthen coves to cook all of the meats. They didn't really hunt big animals, but they hunted small animals like bunnies, so earthen coves were important. They preserved all of the things they picked, like leaves, seeds, especially acorns. Preservation is still around today. And then granaries. Granaries were made out of grapevines, twigs, brush, and grass. Granaries was where they kept all of the, or they broke down all of the grains and stuff and made food for. And just a major subsistence strategy was that they were a tribal community and that they helped each other out. And they worked together as a tribe. They survived together. Their socio-political organization, they were villages about 100 people. Generally, they had a male elder who was named the village chief, and generally there was a female organizer who would help plan the ceremonies. Ceremonies were big in their culture. It was just easier. They knew their territory and they knew their natural boundaries. They were very in touch with nature, so their life wasn't too hard if they stayed in their own area. Their belief system was based off an animistic philosophy. They were very in touch with animals and nature, and they passed down their oral history through talking and stories and stuff, but nature is always the sole focus. It's very important that they prayed for the dead animals to be reborn. Like I said, they didn't really hunt bigger animals, but the fish and the smaller animals like rabbits, it was very special. They always prayed for them to be reborn while they were being cooked. Prior to colonialization, the entanglements with colonial encounters didn't really happen. You might have war between tribes, but even then, it wasn't very popular in California, at least. You were an individual tribe, you had your territory, you knew nature, you were in touch with it, and you knew your beliefs and the ways of life. Sir Francis Drake, who was said to be the first person to reach California, described the native people as free and loving nature without guilt or treachery, which describes the native people well. Their ideas of gender, sexuality, and recognition. They all had special roles, but they were all at equal standing. They saw each other as equals. They all worked for the greater good of the tribe. Everything was just to help each other out and to survive. They were the natives to the land. They made the land what it was. They cultivated and planted fruits and vegetables, and they really just were in touch with the land. And they did it in their communities, in their villages. For gaming and food, like I said, small animals, so fishing, birds, and small animals like rabbits, hawkeyes, small stuff like that. You had plants and seeds, one major one, acorns. Roots and leaves, they were also very, into using nature. Rocks were huge in cooking, and then vegetables. So that just everything on the land. The foreign colonization, before this, their weather, but when they lived in their own tribes, if you were in the higher mountains in the Sierra Nevadas, you had severe winters, whereas if you were on the northern coast, your summers could be brutal if you were in the valley. It really just depends on location. Housing, they made cone-shaped structures that were covered in bark, brush, and grass or tulle. It was built on a wooden structure, so we've all seen them. It was in the previous slide. This is the example of that, or this is what it would used to look like. So that was their housing. Their lifestyle, clothing was very specific. It was made all out of natural elements. Arrows were made from the obsidian that they found. They were just very in touch with the nature. The jewelry and accessories came from shells that they'd pick out food from, like clams. It was just natural elements, and the tattoos at the time were just paints that came from, the coloring came from like foods. But that was also very important to identity. Arts and music is very important. Basketry, which is still around today, was extremely important. They would make these baskets. Kawana is what they would call singing, and they would specifically sing love hymns and lullabies. And they would make their own instruments out of whatever they could find, but that was one of the things they were known for. Native life in general, tools and weapons. Like I said, bows and arrows, spears, nets and strings, as well as mortar and pestle. Ceremonies, very important. Dancing to represent the life, and then a lot of the times ceremonies were also known for passing on knowledge to the adolescents, to the young girls and boys, and this is how they grew up, by watching these ceremonies and hearing these stories. Transportation was basically by foot, but one big thing was that Coast Miwok especially were known for this, but their canoes were exquisite. They would cross rivers in them made of large pine logs. The Eastern Miwoks came up with a new way to do it by using balsa wood and tool rafts. So just connecting more with nature and just finding new ways to survive. After colonization, so colonization completely drastically changed their lives. Spanish colonization to the present life was completely different. Starting off with the two main reasons, the missions and the gold rush. Missions being the main. Native Americans were forced into missions and worked to death. Life was immensely harder if they did not accept the mission's beliefs. They were forced into being baptized, and if they didn't agree, their life was a lot harder. They mainly just ended up dying because they worked so hard. They weren't being fed as they needed to be. They were being abused. But they were being forced into this new culture, and if they didn't agree, basically, they would just end up dying from how hard life was. And if you were lucky enough to survive the missions, then you had to deal with the gold rush, and you were released from this terrible life where you come back to your land and people had destroyed all of the all of the natural elements that you had been in touch with. I mean, all of the plants were destroyed. How hard they worked on it, their land was just torn apart because people were looking for gold, and their homes were taken away, so they had to go find land after that, and they had to do it in the midst of miners. The geographic location and language, it wasn't specific at that point. They had to find their own homes, so a lot of them ended up on small homesteads or ranches. They'd have ranches of just a few people. If you got luckier, you could be on a reservation, which was where a whole bunch more Indians gathered. But still on a reservation, you didn't have the rights that you wanted. It's important that the Miwok language was endangered, and today some dialects still get passed down, but is basically extinct. Other than for the stories, the language is not spoken. Stories are still passed down, but the language is not. And now we have rancherias, which are where they have rights, and they just recently, in the past like 2 decades, have gained more rights, but they have homes now where they're accepted. Grattan Rancheria being the biggest one. The federal government consolidated neighboring groups to be federally recognized, so all of these Indian tribes around where Grattan Rancheria is, they all went to Grattan Rancheria because it was accepted by the government, so it was kind of forced. But the entanglements with the colonial encounters, like I said, missions and the gold rush were important. I'd like to mention the Indian Revolt. It's the last big fight the Indians put up in the missions, kind of being part of the reason why the missions ended. The Indians would just go in and burn everything down. They'd burn down buildings, they would burn down all the supplies, making it almost impossible for the missions to continue running. Um, and during the decade of 1800 to 1810, 1,213 Indians were baptized in this one mission, let alone there's 20 more. But 1,031 were buried, so that's how many people gave into the lifestyle versus how many didn't, and they ended up dying. Currently, gaming and food, Indians have gone on to be they've gone on to do farm work because they found farms and created land, and so now they're farm workers. Some of the best commercial fishermen, oyster harvesting, those are the big things that the Indians were good at, and so they ended up going to do it and making businesses out of it. And then just the regular agricultural jobs on rancherias. Lifestyle, they now live in modern houses as people do. Moccasins are still around. That's one big piece of clothing that was created during that time, that has passed down to life today. Tattoos, a lot of Native Americans have tribal tattoos, just of the pictures and stuff, of the symbols from Native life. And then canoes are around today, and that mainly spurted out of, at least in California, some of the best ones came from Native life. And baskets. Baskets are around today. We have a different way of making them now, just fast paced, but baskets in general have come to be important in life. The last big thing was that federal recognition. Ignore the bottom part. Anyway, federal recognition. This was the biggest part in recent history that helped Native people get where they are, in finally getting rights. That was huge, and that has given Native people some of their life back and given them their importance in life back. I hope you enjoyed the introduction to the Coast Miwok people. Thank you.